We're good? Can you hear us? Okay. Absolute delight to be here with Holly and help welcome her to Grand Rapids and launch this book into the world. Although Amazon did leak a few copies, this is her official release day. So let's just congratulate Holly. Now we've got a few folks coming in. There are 2 open seats right up front if you want them. And some back there. Come on in. While people are still filtering in, I know we have some folks from fairly far away here. So if you want to shout out where you're from, we'll see who came the farthest. Oh my God! We have South Africa. We have an instant winner. Let's see. We had somebody from Traverse City, right? Where is that? Traverse City. Ohio. Akron, Ohio. Oh, several from Ohio.
Columbus, Ohio.
Arizona, nice. Any from Chicago?
Kentucky.
Oh, Kentucky, yeah. Kentucky, that's right, of course, Kentucky. Awesome. Okay, very exciting. Well, I am thrilled to be here in conversation, and I won't tell you all the things that I think about Holly's book, but I will say it's just incredibly perceptive. And if you know Holly at all through her writing, that won't surprise you. It's funny, it's sharp, and it's incredibly caring. It really is a loving book.
I'm not sure everyone will agree, but
I'm used to having not everybody agree with me. Okay, so first question for Holly, and she knows none of the questions are coming. We don't play it that way, so I'll just make some things up. But the first thing I want to ask you is, when in your life did you know you needed to write a book?
wow, that's a good question. Before I answer it, can I just acknowledge a few people?
Please do.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for this, and this is incredibly generous. And reading your book was one of the things that made me want to write this book in particular. And then second of all, I have some friends from a long time ago, my classmates from RVA sitting right here, Nalini and Amy. I have some other, oh my goodness, I'm meeting some people all for the first time. My agents I just met for the first time, David and Laura, who are just amazing. And then the team from MK Safety Net came from far and wide as well to be here. A couple of them were sources, actually 3 of you were sources for the book. And then I just want to, if you are a missionary kid, just raise your hand. That's amazing. We're everywhere. That's the thing about us, is we lurk in the shadows. We're everywhere. Well, so this is actually my second book, but nobody read my first book. Because it was my dissertation that was published by an academic publisher, and it is deadly boring. So, and I don't know that I really wanted to write that book. I wanted to finish my degree. So that's why I wrote that book. When did I know that I wanted to write a book that people would want to read? I actually started writing like for fun when my kids were little, to basically prevent myself from losing my mind. And I had like a mom blog. Tammy remembers the mom blog days. Motherhood for the Phobic is probably still out there. I've migrated some of it to my current Substack. And that's when I really wanted to be a humor writer. And then it just, and then honestly, when the whole Trump thing happened, and then I had already started writing kind of a memoir of my own life, and like light bulbs started coming on and dots started being connected. And so that's when I started to realize, like, I want to write a book that speaks into this moment and to be part of this conversation. And you remember that conversation, because I was like, I want to be part of this conversation. I had hoped and prayed that the conversation would be over by now. But here we are, it's still going on. There's still a conversation to be had, which is probably better for my book sales, but I'd rather not, I'd rather have the functioning society thing than, so yeah, I'd say that that's the short answer, I guess.
So you wrote a few weeks ago about being afraid to release this book, and I copied some of your words in my own Substack this week. So if you read it on Holly's or if you read it on mine, oh, and by the way, if you are not following Holly on Substack, you need to be. Do you want to give a quick shout out where they can find you?
Yeah, I'm a zebra without stripes, and it's a reference to an African proverb of a man, well, a man, they say man, but a person without culture is like a zebra without stripes, and that's how I've often felt as a missionary kid, so it's a kind of homage to that, but then it's like, I think a lot of us are feeling like we don't belong in the places we thought we did these days, and there's a lot of dislocation out there. And so I think it can be much broader than just the MK story. And I write about any number of things. It's a little bit random, frankly. So,
but very, very worth reading and fresh and often very funny. I like that. I didn't realize that you'd wanted to be a humor writer, and I didn't know that you had been a mommy blogger. And now
well,
that
it's kind of an anti-mommy blogger.
It's the best kind. I feel like I need to interview you for my next book, except that chapter is already way, way, way too long. But I think I know your type.
Yeah, I think you do.
Okay, so you talked on Substack a few weeks ago about being nervous about releasing this book. And I mean, any author is nervous about releasing any book, but this book in particular, right? So what are you most afraid of in putting this particular book out into the world?
Yeah, well, I think the missionary and MK community is, well, it's pretty insular and tight-knit, and for a long time that was my community and my sense of belonging. Like you don't really belong, you don't feel belonging like in America per se. You don't necessarily feel belonging in the culture where you grew up. And so it's really this sort of, I call it the bubble world that kind of exists somewhere in between. And that's where you sort of feel that. And so to sort of piss off a lot of people in that world is, I mean, I've traveled a long way. Obviously, I'm quite elderly now, so I traveled a long way, and I don't need that community anymore. But I'm still obviously fond of that community. Fortunately, there's a lot of us in that community who are kind of done with the mythology, and so there's a community within that community that is still, will be my family and will be my home. But it's tough, and I think a lot of the sources that spoke to me wanted to be anonymous for that reason. I think it's very painful when you don't, when that sense of belonging has been so hard won and fleeting, to just sort of take that risk. Even though I'm old now and I'm running out of S to give, I have a people pleaser buried in me, and I'm definitely not someone who loves conflict. So unlike you, please teach me how you do it. That's not me.
I don't know. I think you can hold your own out there, Holly. I've watched you. You're definitely not a stranger.
I talk a good game, but then they come back at me, and I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry.
So in writing this book, right, it is part memoir, but it also is part history, historical narrative, and like you said, you talked with a lot of other missionary kids. Can you talk about a couple of the stories that really stuck with you, or maybe were transformative in how you approach things, or how you shape this book? Stories from other missionary kids.
Yeah, I mean, so my childhood was actually, believe it or not, pretty happy. There's always some trauma there, and there was immense grief at the end. But I would say on the spectrum, my experience was good. And I honestly didn't really know how representative that was when I started talking to people. I mean, I had some ideas that there were bad things that had happened, but it was eye-opening to hear some of the really difficult stories that people told. There was one conversation that really sticks out with a young woman who had grown up in West Africa in a very isolated location, and she talked very fondly about her childhood, but not really fitting in and wanting to fit in. That was the main sort of angst in the conversation. And then at the end of the conversation, but it was generally, she was positive and, and then at the end of the conversation, I asked her just, hey, it hasn't come up, but I just ask everyone just to open the door if you experienced any abuse or anything that you want to talk about. And she paused and hesitated, and then she said, well, my father was a pedophile, and all of them were abused, too young to remember actually, but he confessed later. And it just took my breath away, because I think that's often the case. And to me, it just really hit home for me how easily things can hide under the surface on the mission field in particular. These guys educated me quite a bit from MK Safety Net, because that's what they do. And it's really, and then I got into all the legal ins and outs of that. I talked to some lawyers and child protection experts, and that's when I really realized there are massive jurisdictional holes here. And so yeah, that one really stands out.
And you heard that story because you asked for it. And somebody who writes on abuse in religious spaces, I'm struck so often by this kind of gap between those of us who do speak to that topic and those who don't. Because if you do speak or write on the topic of abuse, or if you bother to ask, as you did, you're going to start hearing stories, right? And then the more you speak, the more stories you will hear. But people who don't ask, people who don't signal that they have any interest or willingness to hear or even believe, are probably not going to be hearing the stories much to begin with, right? So then there's this gulf between people who know and people who remain oblivious, willingly, intentionally, or inadvertently, right? And then books like these kind of break through. And yes, they will get pushback because people don't want to think differently, right? They prefer the image that they had. But I do know that books like this will have the power to open people's eyes and just shrink that gulf just a little bit. And I think that can be immensely helpful. So I'm really glad you asked that question.
Well, it certainly wasn't my intention when I started the book to have a very large section on abuse. I think that was the case with your book too, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And it ended up being a lot more than what either of us anticipated, which is telling. One thing as I've gotten older, you realize in talking to people, especially older people, how prevalent abuse certainly in the past was, so prevalent. And in society, not just religious spaces, but I think what makes it so galling in religious spaces, and particularly on the mission field, is just the rank hypocrisy, especially on the mission field, because you know, those of us who grew up MKs, and I remember, again, my parents were, you know, fine people. They weren't like abusers or anything like that. But it's like, as a child, like, you would go to these churches and hear them talked about as if they were like angels from heaven, and you know them as, you know, flawed, problematic, you know, not great parent. I was, you know, in many ways, and it's just like a real mind F. And I think that sort of hypocrisy for MKs is really angering, you know, even for those who didn't experience abuse.
Yeah, one of the questions that I had relates to that, and those are the unique conditions on the mission field that lead to covering up. And I mean, you already addressed that in part here, but another fact that you raised in the book was the enormous pressure that kids feel not to screw up the missionary work, right? I mean, there are souls on the line here, and the parents' work is just so important, and you, if you report, are gonna harm this man's ministry. And then all of those people are gonna go to hell, right? I mean, that's a lot of pressure to put on a little kid.
And they literally, in some cases, kids are told that. Like in the past, the founder of MK Safety Net, Diane, her story's in there, and they were literally told that as children.
Oh, so I mentioned nuance, right? There's beauty in this book. There's
I
goodness.
hope so.
Like I said, I felt like the book was filled with love. And one of my favorite parts, kind of throughout the book, is when you would describe geography and the physical environment. What was that like for you to kind of revisit, and why were you intentional about adding that to the book?
Well, actually, that's something that came up repeatedly, I had so many sort of aha moments just about my own experience in these conversations. And, you know, for me, growing up in Kenya, particularly our school, Rift Valley Academy, which is just, I mean, can we agree, it's spectacular, right? And anybody who spent time there, even if they had a negative experience, the beauty of the place was a solace, and really for me a sacred thing. You know, watching that sunset over the Rift Valley, you know, and I still, you know, I've gone back repeatedly over the years, and I love to try to be there. You know, I try to like spend the night so I can watch the sunset, you know, there. And then other parts of, by the way, if you haven't been to Kenya, it's the most beautiful country in the world. I do some safaris. I don't make any money. It's for my Kenyan friend. Let me know if you want to go. So serious about that. Just took a group. It was fantastic. Most beautiful country in the world. I'm just saying. Okay. So for me, it was the physical beauty of the place. But then multiple people in like multiple conversations would describe even Diane, who endured horrific abuse, talked about the beauty of the place, and that was something that she's cherished and like kind of held on to. And I think what it is it's like a tangible thing that you can connect with, you know, as someone who feels between worlds and like you don't really belong. You can connect with that physical, and that's something that you can go back to over and over again. And it's not culture, it's not community, it's the physical place. And I think that's a big part of it for us. It also, I think, like for Diane and for myself, like again in difficult circumstances and time, you know, it was like a presence, you know, and a solace. But really, I think it's rooted in wanting to belong, you know, and I tell my husband, you know, I want to be cremated. This is for real, like I'm not just joking around. Like, for real, I want to be cremated because I want to become part of the earth. Yeah, I want to be scattered on, specifically Masai Mara, I think. I don't think they'll let me. If someone shows up with ashes at RVA and like starts dumping them on the field, like I don't know how they would respond to that. But I think we could get away with it in Masai Mara. You know, take it to Masai Mara and like let me float on the wind and like settle into the dust, and then I'll finally like belong, you know. So.
Wow.
Don't you want to become part of dirt?
Well, now I'm thinking about where I want to
You,
go.
let me tell you, if you get put in a box,
Yeah,
like a formal box, and like you're never going to become part of the ground. You're in a box. Don't you want to be part of the earth, Kristin?
My husband's here. Make a note of that.
Just say.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a question on everybody's minds. What did you do in the CIA? In all seriousness, right? This is not an uncommon trajectory, right? For people who grew up on the mission field to then go into the State Department, CIA. You've got some pretty good language skills, and or some do, not everybody. Varying levels of kind of cultural knowledge, expertise that you can bring to that. If you can tell us,
I was a boring analyst. I can tell you everything.
Tell us a little bit about that, and then tell us what you're doing now, because you are retired from that career.
Well, resigned technically, but yeah. It's funny. I went in after I was, offered the job, and in the clearance process they bring you in for an office visit, and I walk into the office where assuming I pass the security clearance, which they make you think that you're not going to pass. So, but then it's like, but then you let me in here. What's going on with this? But I walk into the office, and I met immediately someone that went to RVA. I will not say his name because he's actually undercover. And I met someone who had been the Southern Baptists used to have a program called the Journeyman Program, where it was like young 2-year kind of missionaries, and he had been a journeyman and worked with my dad. And then later I met another RVA grad, and then I met another RVA grad in the State Department, and then I met another RVA grad who was a defense attaché in one of the African embassies. So yes, it's not, I wouldn't say it's common, but it's a good fit actually. And I had not planned on going that route. I had wanted to have an academic career, but then I met my husband, and he was based in Washington, D.C., and I knew like it was gonna be tough to get an academic job, and I was kind of like, I don't know how I feel about this anyway. So I just applied and was hired, and then it was like, well, yeah, this is what I should have been doing all along, because it is a good fit. You do bring some cultural know-how, some language, although I learned Swahili at the CIA, which is embarrassing. It's a common MK thing. If you haven't learned the language, it's pretty embarrassing. And the other thing I realized working at the CIA is I learned more at the CIA about the country that I grew up in. I read history, and I learned way more than I ever learned at the school in the country, which I think is quite a statement about the missionary mindset. And they do a little bit better now, but honestly, not really. It's still short shrift to the actual teaching the kids about the actual place. So it was very humbling to work at the CIA. I was brought in, I was like, I'm here because of all my Africa expertise, and then he's like, oh, you don't actually know much, actually. So it was very humbling.
All right, final question before we open it up to this fabulous audience and all of their questions. What do you hope this book does?
Oof, not get me killed? I don't know. I just want people, it kind of like your book was really a model. It was in my mind for sure as I wrote this, because you also wove history into, and used history and current experience and more recent political experience to try to wake people up. And I think your book really did that. And also people who are already sort of uneasy but maybe didn't know why and didn't have the words and couldn't sort of pin it down. And I think they read your book and then the light bulb came on. So I'm hoping for the same kind of thing. I mean, this book is gonna really anger some people and they're not gonna be willing to be open to the message. But I hope that it will, cause some light bulbs to come on for evangelicals. I'm hoping that's kind of, people gotta wake up more and more all the time. And a lot of people are they're kind of hopeless cases, but I think there's a lot of people out there that they feel uneasy and then maybe they can't quite put their finger on it. And so I hope to be part of that tradition that you have been part of, for sure.
Yeah, the way I see it, you really can't say something that is true and needs to be said today and not make a fairly large swath of people angry one way or another.
Yeah.
And
missionaries are really precious to people.
Yes.
And you know what, a lot of them are, and I mean that in both senses, they're kind of precious, but then also they're precious, and there are really good people doing good work out there, but I think it's really coming at something, people don't like to lose their heroes. That is something none of us like at all. And you see it in politics, you see it in people want their heroes and they don't want their heroes to be diminished. And missionaries have been heroes of the evangelical world for centuries now. And so it's a little bit painful, I think, for people.
Well, if you haven't yet read The Missionary Kids, Holly's a lot nicer than I am in Jesus and John Wayne, trust me.
I try,
So with that, are there questions from the audience for Holly?
We also have a microphone that I can bring to people to amplify the question.
Okay, so raise your hand if you have a question, and Indigo, bring you the mic.
Can you talk some about the relationship you see between the mission field and the rising white Christian nationalism that's alive and well?
Yeah, thank you for that, because that's one of the major themes of the book. And people often don't see a connection there, and in fact, most of the missionaries I know currently on the field are not Christian nationalists at all. And so it's like, well, why are you making this connection? And that's why the history is really important, because the missions from the beginning was really tied up with a sense of American destiny and exceptionalism, and that this is both in a secular sense and a religious sense, America and then the American church is, sort of ordained by God to, save the world. And that's deep in the history there. And, I don't think most missionaries go out into the field thinking that they're on some grand American mission. And it's not really the missionaries themselves that I'm concerned with in terms of this attitude. It's the function that missions have for the white evangelical church. And I think that it is definitely it's connected to this narrative of feeling special, of feeling ordained by God, of this sort of arrogance that white evangelicals have, that is part of Christian nationalism as well. And you have a lot of weird things, like I know so many people, you probably do too, that they are helping welcome refugees to their church, and that they're firm Trump supporters, or they're going on mission trips to Africa, and then they're supporting efforts to get rid of DEI or whatever, and they're cheering that process on, and they're not seeing the connection there. Missions is this redemptive story that sort of absolves people of the rest. I think I say repeatedly, I don't think it's any accident or coincidence that the world, history and the world, the largest, most sophisticated missions organization that has ever existed is the Southern Baptist Convention's International Missionary Board, and it was literally started to appoint slaveholders as missionaries. And I think for Southern Baptists in particular, which is probably the denomination I know the best, missions has functioned as a, sort of fantasy camp, for them from the beginning. This is sort of redemptive escape. They can go to Africa and save souls there, and then so that then it's fine if we're holding slaves here, and we can keep them sort of apart. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. And missions, the concept of missions, and sort of the white evangelical narrative is deeply influenced by Southern Christianity. Now it's a nationwide thing, but I think that's definitely there in the story.
Something occurred to me recently is I have a missionary family, and there was a pedophile doctor that I didn't know anything about. I mean, they were there in the 80s, and I didn't know anything about it until the local news like a few years ago. And when I have this sort of alienation from my family over the last 10 years in the Trump era, I wonder if anyone else can relate to this, where it's...
Oh, no, not
it's,
at all. Not at all.
I mean, in general, of course, but specifically this thing of you'll see this mirroring with sort of the Epstein. There's all this smoke, and you feel like even if I wanted to talk to my family again, how do you not step on anybody's toes when there's an elephant in the room of, well, maybe this could happen because it happened in microcosm where you were, and no one knew anything about it for.
Absolutely, and I think in both cases, again, it's this weird. One of the things that just really, spending so many years in white evangelicalism, that just jumps out at me is this weird compartmentalization of things and not seeing things as wholes. Like you're looking at your faith is sort of discrete to certain behaviors or certain, beliefs or certain, and it's not this holistic thing, and not sort of treating things as, not looking at history, and seeing the sort of broad sweep of history and how that connects to things. So I see like it part of a bigger pattern that I certainly grew up with in white evangelicalism of not, like, we don't want to connect too many dots. So
I'll add to that. In Epstein, I was listening to a podcast on Epstein a few weeks ago, and it was I don't remember which one because I listened to several to try to wrap my head around there's the headlines, and then there's like what was this? How did this work? And because I study those dynamics a lot in religious spaces, and what one episode talked about the chef at who's still famous Hollywood chef, right?
Listen to this too, yeah.
Epstein's chef, who Virginia, Jeff, who recently took her life. He was a good guy. She would, after tucking Epstein in, come down and to the kitchen. She wasn't supposed to be eating food because she was supposed to be kept very thin, but he would make her a pizza and then split a beer, and he treated her like a human. But he watched. He claims he didn't, and claims he had no idea because she went back to him years later and said, he's the good guy. You're going to help me now, right? You're going to help me get this story out. You're going to validate my story. Claimed to remember her, remember the pizza, the beer, not to have known anything else going on. So who are the chefs in this story, right? It's not just the perpetrator. Who are all of the bystanders who are complicit in allowing this to happen? That's what's so astonishing. When you look at these missionary stories, I'll say that I had that big chapter in Jesus and John Wayne, the last chapter on sex abuse in evangelical churches. I had another whole section on abuse in the mission field, which was just way too much to fit into the book. And so I cut that part out, but I did a lot of research into that, and the stories are horrific. And again, it's not just the perpetrators. For this to go on and go on generation after generation, who were the chefs?
But then just to expand it out a little bit, like who are the chefs more broadly, again, in the system that is, I mean, because, you know, I get lots of people are always saying like, oh, but you know, I'm in this sort of white evangelical world, but you know, I don't really like Trump or whatever, but I don't want to make division, whatever. And I'm like, nah, you're 80% of your plus of your community is supporting an authoritarian movement. Like, what are you doing about it? You know, I mean, I hate to be like kind of, that's judgy. People have told me I'm judgy. I'm like, well, you know, sometimes you got to be judgy. But it's like, what are you doing about it? What are you doing about it? Honestly, this book was like, this is what I'm doing about it. This is what I can do about it. I don't know what else to do about it, but this is what I can do. So.
This is kind of a question for both of you, but I'm not sure what age you were when all of this awareness was happening, but if you held on to your faith, how did you hold on to your faith when it probably cracked so many foundations? And how do you hold on to it when there's just so much that distorts what Christianity is?
Yeah, so despite what many will say, I am a Christian. I'm not a very orthodox one anymore, I would say. I'm a pretty liberal, loosey-goosey Christian. But I am a Christian. The gospel and the teachings of Jesus are very dear to me and a guiding force for me. But yeah, it's basically, it was a very long process for me, and I never really, the truth is, like, on the outside I look like I fit in with this world, but I was never quite comfortable, if I was really honest. And so, but it took me a long time to have the courage to really openly shed that. And it was basically sorting through, like, okay, what is this culture, and then what is the faith, or like what is this biblical interpretation that may not be right, that I was told is absolutely sacrosanct, and what is like, and you know, what is the sort of essence, the spirit, you know, of the gospel and Christ's teachings. And it was just a long process, and many authors in particular helped me along that process. And that's another reason why I just think it's such a privilege to be able to write a book, because those books were so formative for me. People like our friend Diana Butler-Bass, and how many cottage people do we have here? I'm like Diana Happy. That's fantastic.
Crew in the back there.
Yeah. Anyway, great Substack she has. But Peter Enns and Rob Bell and Brian McLaren and Rachel Held Evans and all these like enormous influence, because they just sort of, you know, just the suggestion that maybe white evangelicalism wasn't, at least, you know, not the only kind of Christianity. And then I got to the point of, maybe it's not even the best kind of Christianity. Like, maybe it's not, you know, but because I had been grown up being told that it is the only kind of Christianity. So it was a long process, yeah, but I just think you have to keep coming back to the teachings and, you know, what is the essence of the gospel. And honestly, to see it in practice in our time, but I live in DC, and so I go to a lot of faith-based protests and vigils and things like that. And I go to I don't know if you know William Barber, the Moral Mondays that he's been doing, and just to see, like, especially Black Christians, you just see a whole different vision and a whole different, you know, relevance for the gospel in our time, you know. And I think for the Black church, it's always been, this is just a continuation of what the Black church has been about and has been struggling with for, you know, centuries now. This is not a new thing for them, for the Black church. And And so I'm really getting a lot out of sort of becoming part of these gatherings and learning from that perspective.
You and I both went to boarding school at a young age, and so getting back to Missionary Kids a little bit more, in your interviews and in your book, I guess I'd like you to discuss the issue of how missionaries were often pressured, or just because of the nature of where they live, their children have to be sent to boarding schools often at a young age. I was just with my siblings this weekend, and we were talking about that, and how amazed we were at how young we were. But yet the alternative was to be out in the bush by ourselves, removed from all civilization. And I guess we were like, well, should mission organizations even allow parents to send their children away to boarding school? I don't know, I just thought that issue and how it came with your book.
Yeah, there's been a lot of change on that, I will say. I know, like, your people your age, and somewhat into my generation too, there was more pressure. Sometimes there was a mandate, like I know Diane, their family's mission, that was mandated. You had to send them to boarding school. Okay, yeah. From the beginning, like, and then someone, who was the one that you wrote your dissertation on, one of these children's homes for Missionary Kids here in the States? I don't know where she went. I was talking to her before the event. But anyway, there used to be homes in the late 19th, early 20th century. They literally put children on a ship at like age 5 and sent them away forever. And sometimes they never saw their parents again. That was kind of how it all started. And then they started building these regional boarding schools and sending the kids really young. And then so by our generation, a lot of our classmates went to boarding school very young, but it wasn't necessarily mandated, but it was sort of an accepted practice. I would say now it is not, to send kids really young is not as acceptable anymore. And also there's more options in terms of homeschool, but like you mentioned, and I talked to a therapist who works with missionary families, the isolation is pretty devastating as well. So there's not a good, solution necessarily for that on that front. Other than just, I went to a Kenyan primary school for a couple of years, which was great, and my parents should have left me there. I could have gone through 8th grade, and it was a good school, and it was, and I really cherished that experience because that was one of the, I stood out, like I did not fit in at all, but there was like a few of us, including Scott Loud, by the way, we were together at that school. There were a few of us white kids in the school, and frankly, we were treated extra special, which looking back, I cringe about. But I cherish that because we were like, we were kind of really actually part of the community and the culture, instead of sort of in this bubble world that sort of floated over, the land. So I don't know, maybe more families should send their kids to local schools. Maybe they're not gonna get like the best education, but certainly in the younger grades, like who cares?
Yes.
Like, like who cares? And they might, back in the day, they purposely, one of the reasons they sent the kids away, so young, like from the country, is they literally did not want them to make friends with the local kids, because they viewed them as heathens. And they would get corrupted, and there was a lot of racism involved in that. And I just wonder if that's still something that, a lot of things in missions that were explicit in the past still lurk in things now. There's been efforts to counter some of this, but it's still there. The attitudes are still there, the mindsets are still there, and some of the sort of practices are adapted, but still there.
This ends up being a good follow-up and a question I realized I had to reevaluate what I was going to ask as you were answering. So I was also curious about, you said you learned more when you were at the CIA about Kenya than you did while you were there. I wanted to know a little bit the strategies that the adults in the missionary world were using in Kenya, or that written about, talked about in other places, sort of keeping their kids away from what's around them, what's real, and then also how you see that translating to what evangelicals kind of do here, keeping things from, people keeping themselves from seeing the realities.
Absolutely. I mean, nowadays, and it's just gotten worse here in terms of like evangelicals walling themselves off in their little subcultures, and they have their own movies now, and they're really bad movies, and they have their own music and their own. There's Christian insurance companies. There's Christian like everything, and it's just really weird. So there's that. I don't think it's like intentional. Like we don't want our kids to learn about Kenya or elaborate. I think it's an extension of just their own sort of myopia and lack of curiosity. I think a lot of missionaries arrive they think they're coming to help what's here. They're not necessarily coming to learn, My parents, I actually credit them. My mother was super into Kenyan politics, and she would read the paper every day, and she knew all the scandals and the politicians, and she was way more, but most people are just like kind of like checked out. I don't know, I just find there's a lack of curiosity there. I think it comes from just the assumption that, they're here, they're doing everyone a favor by being here, or they're here to save the day. They're not necessarily here to learn anything. And so I don't think it's an intentional sort of, we don't want them to learn. It's just an extension of their own lack of learning.
We have enough time for one more question. Gotcha.
On behalf of MK Safety Net and I guess the side of MKs who are very much appreciative to you, I just want to say thank you so much for writing this book.
Thank you, Sarah. And all of y'all.
My question for you is kind of based on my own experience, because I think a lot of my story correlates with yours in the sense that I had a good missionary kid experience overall. I was talking with Caleb earlier about how I didn't think I had any trauma whatsoever, from my MK days. And then I was recounting to him how, I lived through several coup attempts and,
She had a tank on her street.
Tank down the street,
The TV station that was right next to her
doesn't?
house.
Hey, I live in Washington. We've got tanks. It's feeling more and more like Africa.
So for our friends, fellow MKs, or even missionaries, or people in the evangelical world who question, why are you telling some of these bad stories? Like, why can't we just uplift the good? Can you talk about sort of this can be true and this can be true? I mean, I had classmates who experienced abuse that I didn't discover until later. And I was so surprised that some of our fellow MKs pushed back so hard against this narrative that there were bad things that happened in our own school. They just wanted to just cling to the good. So I just wonder if you would talk just a little bit, even in your own discovery, like, how do you hold that this is true and this is true at the same time?
Yeah, thanks. That's a common thing that's going on in a lot of the MK and missionary communities. I mean, I think on some level, we all know, like, life is complicated, right? I mean, we all have that experience in our life. I think there's actually, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I do think that there is the human brain, in order to make order out of chaos, we form narratives. I mean, historians do that. Like, you can't tell the breadth of, you have to form some kind of narrative, right? It can be a more or less complicated narrative, but the human brain likes simplicity and sort of order in that way. So I don't, it's not, on some level it's a natural sort of human response to complexity, to do that. I think for MKs in particular, some of the response, some of the sort of reaction is because, again, our identities are rooted in such a specific context and in such a such a discrete world. And to sort of have that world upset it's not just scrambling a narrative, it's actually going to the root of our identity. And so I think that's what a lot of it is, particularly in the MK community. But then in white evangelicalism writ large, again, this is a culture that the narrative is central to the identity and to the culture. And this grand narrative of we're sort of the chosen people and we're the ones that get the gospel right, and everything is and this sort of simplified, whitewashed, literally whitewashed narrative is so central to what white evangelicalism is, that when you start scrambling that, people get real upset real quick. And yes, Kristin knows all about that.
Alrighty, let's give it up, guys.